The shrill cry of the alarm clock pierced the quiet darkness of James's bedroom. 5:30 a.m. blinked mercilessly in red across the screen. James groaned and rolled over, slapping the snooze button with a heavy hand. Just 5 more minutes. The silence returned, wrapping him in a fragile comfort, but it was short-lived. The alarm screamed again. Another groan. Another slap. The third time it rang, James reached out in frustration, then paused, his fingers hovering above the snooze button like a man on the edge of a decision. If he hit it again, he'd be late. He sat up slowly, shoulders slumped, the cold morning air biting at his skin. The room was dim, lit only by the pale gray light of dawn pushing past the edges of his curtains. His head throbbed faintly, leftover tension from yesterday's chaos at the office. The day hadn't even begun, and already it was demanding more of him. He rubbed his face and sighed. This was supposed to be his moment of peace, the few sacred minutes before the noise of the world closed in. He had planned, as he often did, to start the day with quiet prayer, maybe a few verses from Psalms or Proverbs. But now he was behind. Again, he glanced at the Bible on his nightstand, its worn leather cover a silent reminder of good intentions too often postponed. Guilt prickled at the edges of his thoughts. "Lord," he muttered under his breath, eyes still half closed, "I'm sorry. I'll catch up later." A hasty, breathless prayer followed, half confession, half plea for strength. Then he was up, stumbling through his morning routine like a man being chased. Teeth brush in a blur, clothes thrown on. Coffee gulped rather than sipped. Moments later, the front door slammed shut behind him, leaving the house still and empty again. The train rattled along the tracks, a dull metallic rhythm that pulsed through the carriage like a heartbeat. James sat by the window, his reflection faint in the glass. Tired eyes, disheveled hair, a face older than his years. The city blurred past in gray tones, its buildings rising like monuments to busyness and broken promises. He leaned his head against the train and sighed, the weight of the morning pressing down on him. His earbuds dangled from his collar, silent. He didn't have the energy for music or the appetite for news. All he had were his thoughts. In the train ride to work, James contemplated his life. He had no peace. Each day bled into the next. Meetings, deadlines, back-to-back calls, and somewhere in the noise, something sacred had gone quiet. He felt distant from God, like a phone ringing in a forgotten room, unanswered. It wasn't that he had turned away entirely. He still believed, still called himself a Christian. But the truth gnawed at him. He didn't put God first in his life. Not really. Not the way he used to. He felt guilty. The kind of guilt that lingered just beneath the surface, not loud or dramatic, just a steady ache, like a song out of tune. He remembered a time, not so long ago, when mornings began with prayer, when scripture filled him with strength instead of shame, when Jesus felt close, even in the busyness. Now it felt like he was chasing something he couldn't name, constantly behind, always running. The train screeched to a halt at another station. People shuffled on and off, briefcases, backpacks, tired faces. James didn't move. He stared at the people, wondering if anyone else felt like this, lost in the middle of success. A woman sat across from him, reading a small devotional. Her brow was furrowed, eyes focused, lips moving in silent reading. James looked away, a strange pang in his chest. Not jealousy exactly. Longing. He pulled out his phone, scrolling past emails and app notifications. Then, almost without thinking, he opened his Bible app. A verse of the day blinked up at him. "You keep him in perfect peace whose mind is stayed on you, because he trusts in you." Isaiah 26 verse 3. James froze. Perfect peace. The words gripped him, tender and piercing. His mind had been everywhere but on God lately. No wonder peace felt so far away. He didn't read further. He just sat with the verse, letting it settle in the silence. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe God hadn't moved, he had. Maybe peace wasn't something to earn, but something to return to. The train lurched again, and the skyline of the city came into view. Another day. Another battle. James slipped his phone into his pocket and adjusted the strap of his bag. The verse still hung in the back of his mind. Isaiah 26 verse 3. Perfect peace. But the words felt more like a memory than a present reality. Comforting, yes, but distant, like a warm light seen through a frosted window. The platform was crowded as usual, people moving like parts of a machine, each one caught in their own current. James merged into the flow, shoulders hunched slightly against the morning air, the ache in his chest still unresolved. At the office, the familiar routine swallowed him whole. Greetings were quick, coffee was bitter, and emails multiplied like weeds. The verse from earlier flickered through his thoughts once or twice, but it couldn't compete with the flood of demands. He kept his head down, answering messages, pushing through tasks, checking boxes. On the outside, he looked competent, productive even. But inwardly, he was running on fumes. His thoughts drifted often, not to God in a reverent way, but to guilt, to the weight of spiritual distance, to the feeling that he was doing everything but what mattered most. And yet, he didn't stop, didn't pray again, didn't open his Bible, didn't even take a real breath. He told himself he would later, maybe during lunch, maybe after the meeting, maybe tonight. But later always came too late, and peace remained out of reach. When he finally looked at the clock, it was nearly noon. He rubbed his temple, a dull ache starting to emerge. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, mixing with the low murmur of voices outside his door. James wasn't ready to admit it yet, but deep down he knew something had to change. He just didn't know what, or when, or how. So he kept going. For now, the afternoon dragged on, each task blending into the next like the ticking of a clock with no hands. James sat hunched over his keyboard, rereading the same line of an email for the third time. His eyes were heavy, his spirit heavier. He pushed back from his desk and looked around the open-plan office. Phones buzzed, fingers flew across keyboards, and somewhere near the window someone laughed. His eyes landed on Rosie. She sat a few desks away, shoulders relaxed, her fingers gliding over the keyboard with the same pace and precision as everyone else. But something about her stood out. It always had. She was smiling, not a forced, polite smile. Not the kind people wore for professionalism or approval. Hers was gentle, calm, like someone who knew something no one else did. James had noticed it before, on other days in passing moments, but today he watched longer than usual. She was doing the same work he was, answering the same demanding clients, facing the same deadlines. But while his chest felt like a clenched fist, she moved through her tasks like she wasn't carrying anything at all. There was something about her, a lightness, a peace. She didn't boast or draw attention to herself. In fact, she was quiet, but not withdrawn, open somehow, present, grounded. James furrowed his brow and looked down at his screen again, but concentration wouldn't come. How does she do it? He glanced back once more. She paused to sip tea from a mug with a verse printed on the side, faded from washing but still legible from where James sat. The joy of the Lord is your strength. Nehemiah 8 verse 10. He felt a strange stirring again. Not quite jealousy, not annoyance either. Just wonder. What's her secret? James sat back, rubbing his temple. He didn't know Rosie well. Just the occasional good morning or polite exchange in the break room. But now, something in him was curious. Drawn. She seemed to have what he was missing. Peace. Joy. Something real. He wasn't ready to ask. Not yet. But for the first time in a long time, James didn't just feel tired. He felt hungry for something that he couldn't quite name. The rest of the afternoon crept by in slow motion. James forced himself through 2 more meetings, each one draining what little energy he had left. His responses were automatic, his smile mechanical. By the time he returned to his desk, it felt like he was moving through fog. He glanced at the clock. 4:37 p.m. Almost there. He leaned back in his chair again, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. As he rubbed the back of his neck, his gaze drifted, almost by instinct, toward Rosie's desk. She was still there, still working, still peaceful. She typed something quickly, but looked up and smiled as a coworker walked by her desk. It wasn't just her ease that struck James, it was her presence. She never seemed rushed, never rattled. And it wasn't because her workload was lighter. If anything, she handled more clients than he did. James caught himself staring and quickly turned back to his screen. But the thought lingered. She's not just organized, she's anchored. There had to be more to it than personality or time management. Something deeper, something spiritual maybe. The verse on her mug replayed in his mind like a whisper. The joy of the Lord is your strength. James rubbed his eyes. His own strength had been running on fumes for a long time. The idea unsettled him, not because it was offensive, but because it reminded him of what he used to have. He used to feel strong too, not from success, but from faith. Back when prayer wasn't rushed, when he didn't feel so far from Jesus. Back when he had joy that didn't depend on how the day went. He glanced toward Rosie one last time before returning to his screen. She was laughing quietly with another coworker. The sound wasn't loud, but it was warm, honest. James looked away. He wasn't ready to talk about it. Not yet. But deep inside, something was shifting. Not like a door swinging open, but like a seed cracking quietly beneath the surface. And though he tried to push it aside, the question kept rising back up. What does she have that I don't? The train ride home was quieter than the morning. No rush, no pressure, just the dull ache of a long day and the weight of thoughts he couldn't shake. James leaned back against the seat, his head resting against the glass. The outside world blurred past in the dimness of dusk. Everything looked alive, and yet somehow he felt hollow. He watched his reflection flicker in the glass. Same tired eyes, same stiff collar, same ache beneath the surface. The world moved around him, busy and bright, but inside, he felt like a ghost of himself, present but disconnected. It wasn't just work. It was everything. He'd let the rhythm of responsibility drown out the voice he used to know so well. Jesus hadn't left. He knew that, but he had stopped listening, stopped making room, and he missed him. There was a time when James couldn't imagine starting his day without prayer, when scripture wasn't an obligation but a lifeline. Now, he rushed through mornings like a man running late for everything, even his own peace. The train screeched into his stop, and James stood, stepping onto the platform. He was tired and longed for the comfort of home. He didn't take the long way home, just straight to his apartment, keys jingling, mind still turning. Later, after a quiet dinner and a half-hearted scroll through his phone, James turned off the TV, brushed his teeth, and stood by the bed in silence. He didn't want another night of falling asleep empty. He sat at the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, and bowed his head. This wasn't unfamiliar. It wasn't foreign. It was like returning to a familiar path, overgrown, but still there. "Father," he began softly, "you know me better than I know myself. You know how tired I am. Not just physically, deep down. I've let life run my schedule, and I've pushed you aside so many times I've lost count. And I hate that I did it." His voice broke slightly, but he kept going. "I know what it's like to walk with you. I've seen your faithfulness in my life. And yet I've been living like I can do it all on my own. I can't. I don't want to." He took a deep breath. "I miss you, Lord. I miss your peace. I miss the stillness that used to anchor me. I don't want to keep living like this, half awake, half full. Draw me back. I'm here. I'm listening again." There was no performance in the prayer. No checklist. Just an honest cry of a weary son reaching back for his father. When he finished, he sat there a while, eyes closed. No visions. No sudden breakthrough. Just a stillness that felt less empty now, like the silence was shared. He lay down, the covers pulled up to his chest, and sleep came without the tight knot in his chest. It wasn't a perfect night, but it was peaceful. The alarm buzzed at 5:30 a.m. James blinked awake. He didn't feel rested, not entirely, but he felt something. A quiet nudge, a small stirring, the familiar voice he hadn't heard clearly in a while. He sat up. No snooze button this time. He moved slowly but intentionally, rising from the bed, padding into the living room. The world outside was still wrapped in sleep. The city hadn't yet stirred. And for once, James didn't fill the silence with noise. He poured a glass of water and sat on the couch with his Bible. He held it for a moment in his lap, thumb tracing the edge of the pages like one might trace the lines of an old map, remembering the way home. He opened it, not to a random page, but to Isaiah. His heart returned to the verse that had tugged at him since the train. "You keep him in perfect peace whose mind is stayed on you, because he trusts in you." Isaiah 26 verse 3. He underlined it softly with a pen, then read the verses before and after. He kept reading, slowly, line by line, letting the weight of the words press against his soul like balm to a bruise. "Trust in the Lord forever, for the Lord God is an everlasting rock." He read Psalm 23 next. Then John 15. The words were familiar, deeply so, but today they felt fresh, like water after a drought. "Abide in me, and I in you." James closed his eyes. "Jesus, help me to abide," he whispered, "even in the busyness, even when I'm tired. Help me to remain close." The stillness around him no longer felt heavy. It felt holy. He sat like that for 20 minutes, reading, praying, listening. And when he finally stood up to get ready for work, the day ahead didn't look easier, but it looked different. Less like something to conquer, more like something to walk through, with someone beside him. The following day, James found himself standing in the doorway of the cafeteria, tray in hand, eyes scanning the room. Voices buzzed around him. Laughter. Forks clinking against plates. The dull roar of lunchtime routine. But he wasn't looking for a seat inside. He turned, heading out the side exit, where a glass door led to a small garden courtyard. It was a humble space. Concrete tables under leafy trees, a few patches of stubborn flowers stretching up through city soil. The traffic noise was muffled out here, replaced by birdsong and breeze. Peace had a sound, and this was close to it. Rosie was already there. She sat at her usual table, off to the right near the edge where the sun slipped through the branches. She had her lunch unwrapped neatly in front of her, a sandwich, some fruit, and a small thermos. Nothing fancy, but there was something graceful in the way she moved, like even eating lunch was touched by peace. James took a seat several feet away, far enough not to intrude, close enough to watch. He picked at his food, but his attention drifted. Rosie didn't scroll her phone or wear earbuds like the others. She ate quietly, thoughtfully, like she was present in a way that felt rare. When she finished her meal, she took a small book from her bag and placed it on the table. James leaned slightly forward. It was a devotional, or maybe a worn journal. She looked up into the sky, her eyes soft, searching. Then she spoke. James couldn't hear what she said. It was too faint, carried off by the breeze. But her lips moved slowly, deliberately. She smiled, just slightly, and lowered her gaze to her book. She began to read, flipping pages like each one held treasure. Every so often, she'd glance up again, toward the sky, like she was having a conversation only she could hear. Her face would brighten, not dramatically, but in a way James couldn't ignore. A kind of knowing smile. A settled joy. James sat still, hands resting on the table, forgotten sandwich in front of him. He didn't understand it, not completely, but he felt it. There was something sacred in what he was witnessing. And it wasn't for show. She wasn't performing. She didn't even know he was there. That made it more powerful, because it was real, personal, intimate. Then, just before the end of the lunch break, Rosie whispered something, eyes lifted to heaven, then softly, with a kind of affectionate reverence, blew a kiss toward the sky. And just like that, she gathered her things and headed back inside, walking with a lightness that felt otherworldly. James sat frozen, his heart stirred in a way he couldn't explain. He'd known people who prayed before. He'd prayed himself. But what he saw in Rosie wasn't routine or religious duty. It was love, relationship, intimacy. And he realized in that moment, he wanted that. Not just the peace, not just the calm. He wanted to know Jesus like Rosie knew him. Not from a distance, not in guilt or hurry, but in stillness, in delight, in a kind of closeness that made someone smile at the sky and whisper secrets into sunlight. James glanced up at the sky himself. For the first time in a long time, he wanted to say something, too, but the words weren't ready yet. So he sat in silence, and somehow it was enough. The next day, James didn't even pretend he had other intentions. He headed straight for the garden courtyard as soon as lunch began, tray in hand, heart already pounding. Not from nerves, exactly, but from something he couldn't name. Hunger, maybe, but not for food. Rosie was there, as always. The sun touched her shoulders like an old friend. She sat at her usual table, the one nestled beneath the flowering tree that always seemed to bloom no matter the season. This time, James chose a table a little closer. Still not next to her, but close enough to hear her voice if she spoke. He kept his eyes down at first, occasionally glancing up as she unpacked her lunch with the same peaceful rhythm. Her movements had a kind of grace to them, intentional, steady, without rush or restlessness. The world might have been spinning at full speed, but Rosie moved like she belonged to a slower clock. She finished eating, brushed crumbs from her fingers, and opened her book again. James recognized it now, not a devotional or Bible, but something more personal. A notebook, worn edges, ink-stained corners. It looked lived in, like it held stories meant only for God. And then she began to read aloud. Not loudly, softly, but just enough for James to hear. They were poems. Poems about him. They weren't churchy or rehearsed. These were raw, lyrical offerings, written like love letters to God, tender and honest. Some lines trembled with awe, others danced with praise. She spoke of his goodness in her quiet places, his faithfulness in her storms. She called him her refuge, her light, her anchor, her joy. Other poems whispered with questions and longing, pleas for comfort, for closeness, for reminders that he was near. She spoke to him like a lover, a best friend, a father who never left her side. There was no hesitation in her voice, no fear of being too much or not enough. Each word was an offering, each verse a conversation. Then she paused, closed the book for a moment, and simply talked. "I don't know how today will go," she said softly, eyes lifted upward, "but I know you'll walk through it with me." She took a deep breath. "I'm tired, Lord, but I'm not afraid." She sat with that for a beat, then continued. "Thank you for reminding me you're here. Even when I forget, even when I rush past you, you always wait for me." James's throat tightened. This was not the kind of prayer he was used to hearing. There was no formula, no performance. It was conversation, friendship. She went on, telling him little things, about the presentation she had that afternoon, the coworker who'd been rude to her yesterday, the dreams she had in her heart that still hadn't come true. She asked for strength, for peace, for wisdom. Then, quietly, simply, she said, "I love you." She blew him a kiss, like yesterday, but this time James saw it for what it was. It wasn't ritual. It was intimacy. Rosie gathered her things, smiling to herself, and stood. She didn't look around. She hadn't once checked to see if anyone was watching. She didn't have to. This wasn't for them. It was for him. And James just sat there, breath caught somewhere between wonder and ache. He hadn't known it could be like this. He hadn't known God could be known like this. So near, so personal. Not just revered, not just believed in, but loved. He watched Rosie disappear back inside, the scent of flowers lingering in the air. His heart stirred. Something sacred had just unfolded in front of him. And though he hadn't spoken a word, James felt as if the moment had invited him in, like a door had opened. And he wasn't sure he could go back to living on the other side of it. For the rest of the day, James was useless at work. Spreadsheets blurred. Emails went unanswered. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, but his mind was far from numbers and deadlines. He kept glancing over at Rosie, more than once. She worked quietly at her desk, her face calm, focused. At one point, she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, looked up, and caught him staring. James froze. But Rosie didn't seem startled or annoyed. She just smiled, soft, shy, like she wasn't surprised. Then she turned back to her work. That smile stayed with him for the rest of the day. It wasn't flirtatious or knowing. It was kind, peaceful, like someone who lived in a different rhythm than the rest of the world. James couldn't understand it, but he couldn't look away either. That night, sleep didn't come easily. He tossed and turned under the weight of everything he'd seen. Again and again, the image played in his mind. Rosie in the garden, reading her poems, speaking to God like he was sitting across from her. The way she smiled up at the sky. The kiss she sent into the air. The way she walked back inside with her head held high and her heart, somehow, visibly full. It wasn't just beautiful. It was real. James stared at the ceiling long after midnight, eyes wide open in the dark. His thoughts were loud, his soul louder. "I don't want to keep living like this," he thought. "I believe in Jesus, but I don't know him like that. I want to. I need to." There was an ache in his chest, something deeper than stress or exhaustion. A kind of spiritual homesickness. Not for a place, but for a person. He exhaled shakily. "I have to talk to her," he thought. "I don't even know what I'd say. But I have to." He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But something had been stirred in him that wouldn't go quiet. The next morning, James felt the weight of his decision before he even opened his eyes. Today, he told himself, "I'm going to talk to her." But even as he said it, nerves tangled in his stomach. What if he said the wrong thing? What if she thought he was being weird? What if, worst of all, she brushed him off with a polite smile and nothing more? He got ready slower than usual, distracted. He read a psalm over his coffee, but the words floated past like mist. Rosie's voice reading those poems, her kiss to the sky, it haunted him in the best way. At work, he kept glancing at the clock, then at her desk. She was there, same as always. Calm, peaceful, a gentle presence in a room full of noise. She smiled at people when they spoke to her. She laughed lightly at someone's joke by the copier. She scribbled notes in a notebook while on a call. James opened his mouth once as he passed her desk, intending to say something, anything. But what came out was a quiet throat clear and an awkward turn into the break room. Coward, he muttered to himself, pouring coffee he didn't want. Lunchtime came. He saw her heading toward the garden area again, notebook in hand. His heart thudded. He grabbed his lunch, forced his legs to move, and followed. far enough behind that it didn't seem intentional, but close enough to close the distance if he found the courage. Rosie took her usual spot beneath the flowering tree, light pouring through the leaves like liquid gold. James hesitated at the edge of the garden, watching her bow her head for a moment before opening her book. He took a few slow steps forward, then stopped, then stepped again. His hands were clammy, his throat dry. What am I doing? She hadn't noticed him yet. He could still turn back, sit at another table, pretend it was just a coincidence again. But something in him wouldn't let him walk away this time. He took a deep breath, then another. Then finally, he stepped close enough for her to see him. She looked up, surprised, but not startled. Their eyes met. "Hi," he said, the word sounding smaller than he meant it to. "Mind if I sit with you?" Rosie smiled, warm and genuine. She gestured to the seat across from her. "Of course," she said. "I was wondering when you'd come say hello." James sat slowly, unsure what to do with his hands. He opened his lunch container, but didn't touch it. His nerves buzzed beneath the surface, but Rosie's calm presence helped. She closed her notebook gently, not hurried, not hiding it, just making space. For him. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything," James said quickly. He paused. "I see you out here sometimes. And yesterday, I couldn't help but notice." Rosie smiled, not unkindly. "You mean talking to God in public? It's okay. Most people do notice eventually." There was no embarrassment in her voice, no defensiveness, just peace. James let out a soft laugh, half relieved. "You're braver than I am." Rosie tilted her head, curious. "Brave?" He nodded. "To be that open with your faith. The way you talk to him, it's like you know him. Like, really know him." She looked at him for a moment, not in judgment, but with a gentle kindness that made him feel seen. "I do," she said softly. "But it didn't start that way. It started with me showing up, talking when I didn't feel heard, reading when I didn't understand, sitting in silence when I had no words." James swallowed, suddenly emotional. "It just seems so easy for you." Rosie shook her head. "It's simple, but not always easy. I have to choose him daily. And even then, I don't always get it right." She glanced at the notebook on the table and then back at James. "But I've learned that God isn't asking for perfect. He's asking for us to be present, to make time for him." Those words hit him like a soft hammer to the heart. "I used to pray more," he admitted. "Read more. I still believe. I do. I just got busy. Work. Life. Everything just sort of took over." Rosie nodded slowly. "That happens. But the beautiful thing about God is, he doesn't go anywhere. He's still right where you left him." James' food remained untouched. His appetite was gone, replaced by something deeper, longing. A hunger of the soul. "I want what you have," James said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "That closeness with God. That peace." Rosie's gaze softened. "You can have it," she said gently. "It's not something exclusive or mysterious. That closeness, it's what God wants with all his children." James tilted his head, listening. "God is a father," she said, and there was something reverent in her tone, something deeply personal. "It's not just a title. It's not just a theological fact. A real father. He created us not just to obey him or work for him, but to know him, to walk with him like Adam did in the garden, as a child with a loving parent." She paused, her eyes glancing upward briefly, as though remembering something beautiful. Earthly fathers, at their best, want to spend time with their children. They care about their hurts, their questions, their joys. They make time for them. But even the best earthly father is just a glimpse of how much God wants to be near us. He wants us to come to him with everything, not just the big emergencies, but the little details. He wants to hear about our day, our thoughts, and even our silence. He wants to laugh with us, cry with us, and sit with us. She smiled softly. And he doesn't want us to feel like we have to earn that time. He's not keeping score. He's just waiting, with love. Every day. James swallowed, something catching in his throat. Rosie leaned forward slightly, her voice warm and steady. "You see, God is a person, not a distant being, not a checklist or a rulebook. And like with any real relationship, closeness grows through time together, through conversation, through being honest. When you make space for him, even in the middle of your messy life, he fills it with himself." She looked directly at him now. "He waits for you, James. He yearns for that time with you. Not because he needs it, but because he delights in your presence." Then, in a quiet voice full of certainty, she said, "James 4 verse 8 tells us that if we draw near to God, he will draw nearer to us." She met his eyes. That's not just encouragement, it's a promise. James swallowed hard. He felt something stir in him, a flicker of hope and grief all tangled together. It's a sense that maybe he hadn't been as far away from Jesus as he thought. Maybe he'd just stopped showing up. "Rosie," he began but didn't know what to say next. She didn't press him. They sat in silence for a while, not awkward, just present. The wind carried the scent of cut grass and warm stone. Somewhere, a bird sang a few sweet notes, like a prayer in flight. Only when the sun had begun to dip a little lower did Rosie glance at her watch. "We still have a few minutes," she said gently. "Would you like me to read one of the poems I wrote to him?" James hesitated, then nodded. She opened her notebook and found a page marked with a leaf. And when she read, her voice was soft but full, like water flowing over stones. "You are my stillness in the storm, my steady place when I am unsteady. You are not far off, not once. Even when I forget you, you remember me. Let me walk with you in the quiet, and let your voice be the song I wake to." James listened, eyes stinging, heart wide open. He didn't know what tomorrow held, but for the first time in a long while, he wanted more. The lunch bell rang too quickly. Rosie glanced down at her watch and gave a soft sigh, as if she wasn't quite ready to leave the stillness behind. She looked up at James with a kind smile. "I'm really glad we talked," she said. "It's never too late to start, James. God's waiting, always." James nodded, but the words caught in his throat. He managed a quiet, "Thank you," and she smiled once more before heading inside, her steps light, almost unburdened. He remained seated. The garden seemed quieter now, as if her words still lingered in the air like perfume. James sat motionless, the warm afternoon sun brushing his skin, but all he felt was the stir inside his soul, a quiet unraveling of all he thought he understood about faith, about Jesus. He had called himself a Christian for years, attended church when he could, said grace before meals, offered up quick, breathless prayers in moments of crisis or guilt. But what Rosie had, that was something different, something real, something alive. He thought back to the way she looked up at the sky as if she were speaking to someone right there. How she read her poems aloud like letters to a beloved friend. How she called God faithful and kind, not as theology, but as someone who knew. God delighted in him? That word stayed with him. He had always imagined God as patient, maybe even forgiving, but delighted? That God actually wanted his time? That he waited, not with disappointment, but with open arms? James's heart ached with a mix of wonder and sorrow. How many mornings had he rushed past God's invitation? How many nights had he fallen asleep with his phone in hand, too distracted to whisper a simple "Good night, Lord"? His mind drifted to the verse Rosie had quoted. "Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you." He whispered it to himself, turning it over again and again like a smooth stone in his hand. It didn't come with conditions. It wasn't reserved for the super spiritual or the unwaveringly faithful. It was an open invitation, a promise written for the weary, the distracted, the ones who had wandered, for people like him. As he stood and made his way slowly back inside, something in him had shifted, not dramatically, but undeniably. A question had been planted deep in his soul. A hunger stirred, and for the first time in a long while, James didn't feel quite so hollow. He felt seen. He didn't have the answers yet, but maybe he was ready to start asking the right questions. That night, James didn't reach for his phone. He didn't numb himself with television or scroll through endless distractions. Instead, he sat in the quiet of his apartment, lights low, the hum of the city outside his window like a distant lullaby. The same window he always looked out of without really seeing. But tonight, he noticed the stars, faint, scattered, yet somehow reassuring. He opened his Bible, slowly this time, not out of duty, but desire. He turned to Psalms, the place that had once been familiar, and let the words wash over him. "The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit." It was as if the page spoke directly to him. Then he prayed, not polished, not perfect, but real. "Lord, I don't really know where to begin, but I'm here." He paused, the words catching in his throat. "I've been distant. I've been distracted. I've filled my days with everything but you. But I want to come back. I want what Rosie has with you. That closeness, that joy, that peace I've been chasing in all the wrong places. I don't have much to offer, but I'm offering what I have. Me." He sat in the silence, not rushing, not trying to fill the gaps. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone in the quiet. He felt heard. He went to bed with a stillness that surprised him, fragile but present. The next morning, James woke before his alarm. The sky outside was still cloaked in a soft, early gray, the kind of stillness that invited quiet things to speak. He sits up in bed for a moment, breathing it in. Then, instead of reaching for his phone, he reached for his Bible. He didn't rush. He turned to the Psalms again, letting the words of David pour over him. "O God, you are my God. Earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you." Psalm 63. It felt right, like the psalmist had borrowed his own heart and given it language. James read slowly, not just a verse, but the whole chapter. Then another. He paused often, letting certain lines echo in his spirit. He underlined, whispered prayers in between the passages, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was checking a box. He was spending time with God. He closed his Bible gently, letting it rest on his lap, then bowed his head to pray. "Father, thank you for this moment. Thank you that I don't have to earn my way back to you. Thank you that you want this, me sitting here with you. Help me keep showing up. Help me to love you more than comfort or control. Give me grace for today, peace when I'm overwhelmed, strength when I'm tired. And remind me, Father, remind me that you are near." He sat a while longer, quiet, not rushed, just present. Then, as he prepared for work, he carried with him something more than a routine. He carried communion. And when he opened the Bible app to revisit the verse from yesterday, "You keep him in perfect peace whose mind is stayed on you because he trusts in you." Isaiah 26 verse 3. He didn't just read it. He believed it. Even as the day ahead loomed busy and loud, James walked out the door with a kind of peace he hadn't known in a long time. Not because life had changed, but because he had begun to. At work, things weren't magically different. The meetings were still long. The emails still piled up. But James moved through the day with a quiet steadiness, a grounding. And when he passed Rosie in the hallway, he didn't just look in wonder, he smiled. She smiled back. Something had begun. Not a resolution, not a sudden transformation, but a return to peace, to presence, to the Father who had been waiting all along. And James knew this was just the beginning. James 4 verse 8. "Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded."